When we think about the Cold War, it's easy to imagine the USA and the USSR as locked in a deep-seated rivalry that defined much of the 20th century. But the roots of this tension extend far beyond the era of nuclear standoffs and ideological battles. In fact, the complex relationship between these two superpowers was shaped by decades of political maneuvering, economic interests, and shifting alliances. So, how did the United States and the Soviet Union view each other before the Cold War even began? And why did their relationship evolve from cooperation to confrontation? Let's dive into the history to uncover the answers. How did the USA and Russia interact before the Cold War? The relationship between the United States and the Russian Empire was surprisingly positive in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The two nations, though geographically distant, found common ground in their mutual interests and shared goals. This camaraderie was disrupted dramatically by the Russian Revolution of 1917, which saw the overthrow of the Tsarist regime and the rise of Bolshevik power. The U.S. under President Woodrow Wilson was not exactly thrilled about this sudden shift. Wilson was particularly concerned about the potential fragmentation of a country that had been a stable ally. In a bid to navigate this upheaval, Wilson invited representatives from both sides of the Russian Civil War, the Bolsheviks and the anti-communist whites, to the Paris Peace Conference. However, this effort to broker peace was largely futile. The whites had little real power and were unable to leverage any significant demands, while the Bolsheviks dismissed the treaty as imperialist and irrelevant. The Bolshevik leadership was confident that their revolutionary spirit would soon ignite similar movements in the West. What happened after the Russian Revolution? After the revolution, the U.S. and the new Soviet government effectively went into a period of mutual disregard. American investors who had substantial assets in Russia were furious when the Soviet regime nationalized these holdings without compensation. This left a sour taste in Washington's mouth and complicated any potential for constructive engagement. The U.S. refused to formally recognize the Soviet government, which only deepened the mistrust between the two nations. Meanwhile, the Soviet government viewed the U.S. as a capitalist adversary, which further fueled the distrust. The 1920s and 1930s were marked by this simmering tension, with neither side willing to extend a hand of reconciliation. The U.S. was particularly wary of Soviet influence and feared that the Bolshevik ideology might spread beyond Russia's borders. Why did the relationship improve in the 1930s? The dynamic began to shift in the 1930s. By this time, many Western European countries had officially recognized the Soviet government, and the U.S. found itself under increasing pressure to do the same. Negotiations were eventually undertaken to normalize relations. The U.S. agreed to recognize Stalin's government in exchange for several concessions, including the promise of religious freedom for Americans in the USSR, increased trade opportunities, and a commitment from Stalin not to meddle in American domestic politics. This agreement was seen as a major win for the U.S., which had managed to secure significant benefits with relatively little compromise. However, it quickly became apparent that many of Stalin's promises were, at best, superficial. While the U.S. saw this as a diplomatic victory, Moscow's assurances were largely disregarded. How did 1-2 affect U.S.-Soviet relations? The real turning point in U.S.-Soviet relations came with the outbreak of World War II. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, the United States extended material support to the Soviets as part of the Allied effort to defeat the Axis powers. This cooperation was pragmatic. Both nations had a common enemy. However, underlying suspicions persisted. The United States was concerned about Soviet dominance in Europe and hoped that the immense cost of fighting Germany would weaken the USSR to the point where it could no longer pose a threat. Despite this temporary alliance, the post-war world order quickly exposed the fragility of their partnership. The ideological and strategic differences between the two superpowers became more pronounced, setting the stage for the Cold War that followed. What was the legacy of their early interactions? The early interactions between the USA and the USSR laid a complex foundation for their Cold War rivalry. Their initial positive relationship was undermined by revolutionary change, economic conflicts, and differing ideological perspectives. Although there were attempts at reconciliation and cooperation, mutual distrust remained a significant obstacle. The Second World War, while providing a temporary common cause, ultimately highlighted the deep-seated differences that would fuel decades of tension. In conclusion, the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union before the Cold War was marked by a mix of cooperation, suspicion, and pragmatic decisions. The seeds of Cold War animosity were sown during these early years, setting the stage for one of the most defining geopolitical conflicts of the 20th century. Understanding this history helps us appreciate the complexities of international relations and the long-lasting impacts of historical events on global politics. Thank you for joining me in exploring this fascinating chapter of history. A special thanks to my patrons for their support: James, Bizet, Kelly, Moneymaker, Sky, Chappelle, Kitka, Udan, Wang, Anthony, Beckett, Marcus, Rod D, Martin, YN, Hockey, AF Firefly, Spencer Lightfoot, Gustav Swan, Captain Pig, Alex Schwinn, Shannon, The Maxer, Marvin, Casal, Spinning Three Plates, Andy McGee, Coppertone, Calling Dr. Howard, Dr. Fine, Dr. Howard, Maggie Patkowski, Kim and Yun, Winston Cood, Jim Stromberg, Remco, H-Man, Miss Isett, Charles Fern First, and Words About Books podcast. Your support makes these deep dives into history possible, and I look forward to exploring more with you in the future.